So I want to make sure that I correct a remission that I made earlier. I want to recognize one other person today with us. During the work with Fenestration Canada and Fenestration Manitoba, Mr. Gord Sire was the chairman, president of Fenestration Manitoba, and he was a phenomenal partner and supporter and collaborator with us working through the process. And I want to make sure that I recognize that. And Gord is being a pioneer in the Manitoba window industry, in the Canadian window industry. So I want to thank Gord for his support and all of that work during that process. So thanks, Gord. Appreciate it. Thank you. I've known Gord a long time, and he's always been just a great guy to work with. So, okay, so next up, we're going to have Adrian. He's going to be back with us in just a second. So Adrian has, where is it? Like I said earlier, Adrian joined us at the fall last year. Where the heck is it, man? And came in as our codes regulatory director. But once the tariff discussions began and all of that activity, he dove right into that work. He's been like night and day, connecting with people, working with our members, getting feedback from our members on the impact, and asking, what can we do as an association to support our members through this tariff activity. He's engaged with the Minister of Finance federally. We've provided letters to the federal government, provincial governments on what some of the challenges are and some of the more critical impacts. For example, we don't make float glass in Canada, which I'm sure everybody in this room knows. So that is a very high critical component that our members can only get from either the US or from Asia, from Europe. So that has formed a big part of the conversations of trying to make sure that float glass doesn't be a tariff component for our members. So we're working on that. Adrian's going to be here in a second to walk through a lot of the work that he's done, where we're headed, where we're at as of this morning. Because if you've been following any of it, it changes certainly daily, if not hourly. And I've pretty much run out of things to say, waiting for Adrian to get back. So give us a second. As soon as he gets here, we'll get going. I wouldn't even want to attempt it, because if it was me that was presenting on tariffs, I would be saying trade good, tariff bad. And that would be the end of my presentation. So I have to rely on Adrian's work on this topic. So, well, we have a moment. He had to something that he couldn't put off. He had to run off for a second. So, is any questions about FenCon maybe that I can answer, or maybe what I do, or what we can do for you guys? No? Quiet crowd. Spring conference. I can talk a little bit about some events. Top Glass at the end of this month in April. I'll be presenting on some work that Fenestration Canada has been doing on size-specific thermal modeling. We're very, very close to launching a tool that you'll be able to take your NFRC or CSA U-value solar heat gain data, plug it into our calculator for a product that is a different size than NFRC model sizes, and it will generate you the U-value in solar heat gain and visible transmittance for that different size product. I have a minute, so I'll jump into that a little bit. The City of Vancouver has something called the Energy Modeling Guidelines, and within that document, there he is. So now I got to speed up now. So I was trying to draw it out, Adrian. Now I got to speed up. Anyway, I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later on. It's not a specific item, but it's something we're working on. We're very close to launching. That's going to be a great tool for the industry.
All right.
Okay, you ready to go?
Thank you.
You're up. Yep.
And one. All right. Thank you very much. Apologies for that. So I hate the whole what's it? Tariffs are tricky. I mean, I personally felt like this was one of those moments where our house was on fire. I'm really grateful to be in the moment, to be able to support you guys. I'm getting, 1 to 2 emails, a couple calls a day for the last. Yeah, so I'm gonna make it quick, but so there's been a lot on this topic. I've got about 20 minutes to give you just the bare basics. So don't hesitate to come poke at me afterwards. There's a lot on this subject. So first, I'm just going to run you through where we are. What does the tariffs currently look like? When it comes to the Canadian tariff that was threatened, that was going to be 25% on all goods, with the exception of energy and potash, which was going to be a 10%. We're currently exempt from that, or at least the CUMSA agreement exemptions are in place. That's actually important to note for anybody messing with the border, sending products over. Most of the time, brokers, the ones that we're going to be interacting with that are our experts at the border, they've been doing what's called favored nation type of trading. So that's a 2% generally on any products that are coming through. Because of where we are in this tariff conversation, that doesn't work anymore. You actually have to do the paperwork for the CUMSA agreement exemptions. As far as I can tell within our own industry, there is nothing that the CUMSA agreement did not cover. So it's just going to be important that you talk with your broker and make sure that you're getting the appropriate paperwork at the border. Have the discussion. I like to start this conversation off by saying I am neither a broker, an accountant, or a lawyer. And all three are kind of important for this conversation. But yeah, I'll say the big takeaway that I want you guys to walk away from is if you don't know your broker by name, go make that call and go have conversations with them. That I don't think they've ever been as important to our kind of stakeholders as they are today. All right, so next, automobiles were put into place April 3rd. So we've got it on both the Canadian and US sides. So expect cars are more expensive. And the one that probably impacts us the most, frankly, is steel and aluminum. So, I'll get into it a little bit. And actually, because of how tight our time is, what I think I'll do is I'll just get right into the steel and aluminum conversation now. So there are tariffs on both sides of the border when it comes to steel and aluminum, but there is a fairly substantial difference of a term called derivatives in the conversation between US traded steel and aluminum and Canadian traded steel and aluminum. So when we buy steel and aluminum from the US, when we've got importing steel and aluminum, we don't have what's called a derivative concern about that product. So if you have a steel reinforcing, or you have just the aluminum or steel ingots, those are all just materials, and those would be impacted by the tariffs. But if you make like an aluminum window and you've got glass and you're buying that from the US, that's not impacted. But if you were to go the other way around, where we've got a aluminum window with glass that you're selling into the US, that is impacted by the tariffs because it is considered a derivative product of that steel and aluminum material. So we also have semiconductors. There were conversations yesterday about pharmaceuticals, but one of the things I'll leave you with is that up until recently, we've been dealing with what's called an IEEPA tariff, or an International Economic Powers Act tariff. So that gave the Trump administration unilateral power to go ahead and make decisions fairly quickly. What I think is interesting is we look at lumber and timber. This is projected to go into effect later in the year, and they're using what's called a 232 tariff, which is, and I wish I had a bit more information for you on why they decided to shift gears on what type of tariff to use. But if they continue to use a 232 tariff, one of the things that are a benefit to us at the moment is that is a longer implementation time. Typically, it takes somewhere between 9 months and a year to implement a 232 tariff. So I view that as a positive. But as far as I can tell, timber, lumber, and derivatives from the US, that's coming. Copper as well. So when it comes to Canada imposing counter tariffs, phase one has been implemented since February 1st. So for our industry, that mostly impacts wood window and vinyl windows. So anytime that the U.S. is selling wood window, vinyl windows into our market, that is going to be tariffed. Then again, steel and aluminum is tariff. That was March 12th. And again, cars are going to be expensive. Any of U.S. make cars bring in, expect that price tag has gone up. So this next portion of the conversation, I'm going to try my best to give you some of the, call it, basic knowledge around managing the border and some of the tactics that I've learned over the last couple months. So when it comes to concepts, Incoterms is probably one of the more impactful when it comes to contract terms. So Incoterms is international commercial terms. These are a series of legal names for the type of responsibility you have at the border. So these are things that you could be including into your contract, into your broker paperwork, that's going to create at least for the brokers and for the borders, it should create a very clear understanding of who's responsible for what portions of that trade. Next is harmonized code description. So HS codes are related to every conceivable item that you could be putting through the border. There's roughly 5,600 or so individual codes at kind of the general level of HS codes. There's also a series of nationally specific HS codes. So it's a lot, and each one comes with its own rule set. And then we get into a little bit of substantial transformation, which is you're taking materials and then you're adding value to that material in such a way that it changes that HS code from, let's take glass, for instance. I'm going to take an insulated glass unit, and then I'm going to put that into a window frame. That has now been substantially transformed. That window now has its own HS code and it's treated differently. So that's going to come into play a little bit whenever we're talking about some of the tactics you can use if you're, say, buying product in the US, transforming it in Canada, and then sending it back to the US. We talked a little bit about derivatives. I'm going to get into just a little bit about material dominance here in a slide or so down. So when it comes to Incoterms, I'm going to kind of skip through this first item. There are 11 Incoterms that you could be using that defines, from here, I'm actually going to bring that infographic back up. So from, you producing the window to your customer actually having it on site, there are a variety of steps that you can define who's responsible. So, one of the easiest ones that we see is FOB, free on board. This is a technical term that has legal definition on who's responsible. So if you're using FOB for your paperwork, what you're saying is that I am responsible for loading those goods onto a truck. I'm not responsible for the truck. I'm not responsible for the insurance. I'm not responsible for duties and taxes. These are all things that belong to the buyer of those goods. Versus something like DAP or delivered at place, you are responsible for loading those goods onto a truck, either your truck or a truck you've rented. You are responsible for transporting those goods down to the US. You're responsible for the insurance. But by using that term, you're clearly defining I am not responsible for the customs, and I am not responsible for import duties, and I'm not responsible for unloading at US destination. So I cannot express enough. One of the easiest things for you to be doing is to be reviewing contract language and making sure Incoterms are congruent across all of your paper trail. HS code, I've kind of explained this a little bit, but it's an online portal of a variety of rules that are assessed for each one of those HS codes. It is really complex. It goes back to my comment. Your broker is one of the best stakeholders for you to bring back into the room and have a serious conversation. And I've talked with a whole bunch of them in the last month or so. There are ones that I think are very on top of these conversations, and those that our relationship with the U.S. has been pretty benign. It's been really easy to trade over the border. There's really not been much of a conversation. I think this is one of those that we've just kind of overlooked. So yeah, meat and potatoes. We had a series of counter tariffs that were planned depending on how April 2nd and the Liberation Day conversations went. The most severe of the ones that impacted our industry was float glass. For those that don't know, we have not manufactured float glass in Canada for 33 years. And we import 90% of our glass from the US. So I overwhelmingly got support from our manufacturers and from our board to go ahead and pursue remedy for that. So we hired a lobbyist firm where we got in front of the director of the Department of Finance. The director is the person that provides the suggestion to the ministers on how that decision was to be made. Um, you know, I if that list had gone through unchanged, there wasn't an area of our industry that wasn't impacted. We were going to be tariffed on the materials that are used to resin, any of the metals before. There wasn't an area I could find that we weren't going to wind up spending an additional 25% if we were importing it. But we fought float glass specifically because it is something that we don't have an alternative option for. It was actually a really challenging decision to focus only there. I think for many residential, specifically punched window opening manufacturers or those that are working on those type of windows, insulated glass units are obviously another big risk that we oftentimes are bringing them in on that side of the industry from the U.S. The problem is that we're manufacturing about 80% of our own insulated glass units in Canada. So it was really challenging to kind of decide which portion of this conversation to focus on, because in that example, if we were to have, if everything had gone through the way we thought it was going to, and we had asked for the insulated glass units to come off, we would have been in a position where the U.S. Was selling insulated glass unit at a price that we were not able to turn around and sell insulated glass units to the U.S. for. That we create trade discrepancies when we're not going toe to toe on tariffs, which is frustrating about this whole conversation. It's something that I now that I've spent enough time down this rabbit hole, it's a double-edged sword, and it's a double-edged sword that as soon as you use it, it becomes another double-edged sword. So I kind of talked about substantial transformation, and so I'm going to skip this slide. Derivatives, this slide was really designed to help kind of explain if I'm in the U.S. and I'm shipping into Canada, Canada was not going to charge an aluminum window with glass in it as a derivative. But if I was in Canada and selling an aluminum window into the U.S., the derivative portion of that conversation does trigger a tariff requirement. Material dominance is an interesting conversation in that. So I had an example where a spacer bar company reached out and they had a composite material of steel and fiberglass. And so the conversation became, do I assign an HS code for the metal for it being a metallic item, or do I associate the fiberglass in it? And so material dominance is a term where it depends on the quantity of material or the intent of the material. So if they had a majority of their material was metal, then yes, they need to associate under a metallic HS code. If the majority of their material by volume could have been fiberglass, then they do not have to associate under that HS code. They're associating under a fiberglass or a composite material HS code for spacer bars. So contracts, I've talked about Incoterms. Next is like a non-payment consequence. So one of the things that I keep seeing is I'm talking to brokers and I'm talking to those that are actually shipping things over the border. Because this is fairly new, there are mistakes that are being made, specifically about who owns what responsibility. So whenever you are shipping over the border, what oftentimes the broker has been doing is you have been the import of record. That's not correct depending on what term you're using. So if you are being categorized as the import of record, then you are likely the first one to get that duty payment. So in the event that that happens, it's important to have something like a non-payment consequence clause in your contract, so you can articulate what happens if your buyer is not paying for that, and then because there's going to be consequences if you don't pay the border for what they hand you. Anyway, explicit duty payment responsibilities, one that's probably a bit of an overdue on the contract, but it's nice to go ahead and just clearly articulate who's responsible between the two. Your Incoterm should do that, but it is a technical term. I would say it's mostly in front of your broker. So general strategies, one of the easiest gimme strategies is to make sure you break out your transportation costs. So your transportation costs are not included as part of something that can be tariffed. So, and this is kind of the truth of the whole process. It's a paperwork thing. Like we have a lot more paperwork if we find ourselves in a position that we're having to deal with the tariffs. So yeah, breaking out that cost is important. I think one of the more important things I could imagine is to strategize with your team on what the weaknesses of your supply chain looks like, what those paper changes look like. I mean, I feel like I'm kind of beating on a dead horse there. Most of the manufacturers that I've talked to have been responding in that way. But if you have not if you have not had a day where you just sit down and you look at the risks within your supply chain and how you would adapt to something like this, it's critical. You kind of need that plan in the background. Again, I'm harking on the broker conversation. So when it comes to strategies that you can use when it comes to management of goods, goods returned, or HTS 9801, is a way that when you buy, let's call an insulated glass unit. So I'm buying an insulated glass unit from the US. I'm bringing to Canada. I'm going to go ahead and manufacture my window, and then I'm going to ship that window back to the US. The moment that I put that glass into the frame, it's been substantially transformed. What I can do instead is, if I'm willing to put the man hours into glazing that in the US, I can actually take that glass and take that frame and ship it down to the US and go through this foreign goods returned. And so the value of the insulated glass can be broken off into only cost of goods. So you can actually remove that duty responsibility, at least on that one particular item. There's also a duty drawback, which is actually pretty similar to how the HTS 9801 works, but it's within Canada. There's duty deferral. So what you're doing there is you're saying, I'm going to buy this good. And this actually goes beyond the substantial transformation. You can do this with product that you are transforming. You can do a deferral where you say, I am not paying the tax at the border because I'm going to be shipping that product back to the US. So as long as you're following that paperwork, you can actually remove that tax liability as it's coming through, or you never really pay it. You're just deferring it until it goes back. Which these three methods are one of the ways you trigger what's called a two-invoice strategy. It allows you to create an invoice to both the broker and your customer. This is one of the few legal ways that I think you can kind of play with your numbers, is you're providing those cost of goods on the materials that are going to be either, specifically on the HTS 9801, any of those foreign goods return. You can use that cost of goods, and then you can apply the additional costs where you want to in that spectrum. It's kind of tricky in the sense that the border actually does have a little bit of an average of what values are. And specifically, if you have history going back and forth over the border, they're going to have what your product value has been over the course of time. So, the expert that I talked to at the BDO, she was really clear that be careful about playing with those numbers too much. I know it's going to be attractive to do so, but if they've got history, they likely are going to pull you aside and have that conversation. And then last is transfer pricing. So for those companies that have companies both in the US and Canada, that provides you the opportunity to sell your components to your Canadian business, and you can manage costs differently that way. You don't have to show your profitability in a moment like that. All right, so last for Canada is tariff remission. So at Fenestration Canada, one of the things we're doing with our lobbyist group is we're actually going to be putting forward a remission for float glass. So in the event that the float glass is not removed in the future, at least we have a remission support or remission submission that allows us to remove float glass for the industry as a requirement. This can be done at an individual company level or country level or industry level. The Department of Finance has been clear. Do be thoughtful about using duty deferral, duty holdback before people try to use the remission. Their office is, as far as I could see from the comments from the last meeting earlier this week with the Department of Finance, they're feeling overwhelmed with the amount of remissions. It is likely that you will get lost in the shuffle, and you're going to have a really good argument for why your company needs remission. But the criteria for remission is, we don't make it in Canada, or regionally you don't have access to it. So it's actually a pretty wide breadth that you could try to categorize. So a good example of one that you might be able to use is like resin. Resin's produced, as far as I know, only in Niagara Falls in Canada. So if you have a profile that you're extruding, that's probably one of those that a remission is reasonable. So, I got involved in this about 2 months ago whenever that Truth Social post came out about tariffs back in December. And if in Canada, we've spent a lot of time, I've been going through a lot of this and those conversations. And the framework that we're thinking about moving forward is kind of in these 4 pillars. Let's go back. So safeguarding our supply chain, a lot of this conversation about float glass is about that. And it's like, how do we make sure that the elements of our supply chain that are vulnerable are protected? And then when it comes to float glass, there's a big conversation on what is it going to take in order for us to produce that in the future. So we look forward to talking a little bit more about that. But trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, forgive me. I was rushing through this presentation, so I'm losing some of my cues. But yeah, this will be roughly the framework that we will be applying initiatives to as we move forward in the next couple months. Next is improving the fenestration manufacturing space. So how do we help increase fenestration manufacturing? Protecting members from unfair trade practices. So this is something we've been getting a lot over the last 6 months to a year. And if Mike Bruno's around, he's been telling us about this for the last 2 years. Is there's some concerns about import products that either have been being dumped here or subsidized, and I've gotten a lot of complaints about that. We have but I just want to make sure I'm separating 2 portions of the conversation. There is what I consider non-compliance, so that is products that are showing up without labels, without appropriate testing, and then there is free market issues around this conversation. We'll be working more on some of the initiatives attached to that. And then last is decreasing non-value added costs. There's a series of standards and regulations that are costing our members here in Canada quite a bit, and so we'll be looking at how we either make that simpler or how we disconnect from a handful of those. But yeah, anyway, I apologize that it was a little rushed, but is there any questions?
Yep. Hang on. Zan.
So this tariff thing is kind of moving targets. Sometimes it's you have 25%, 10%, or no tariffs. Is there any way or any program, as you know of, we can reclaim those tariffs if we paid, not the way supposed to?
Yeah. Unless you're taking those products and you're manufacturing them here in Canada and then shipping them back to the US, the remission process is the only way to do that. And it's not a reclaim unless it's the duty drawback. But the duty drawback is how you would reclaim that if you're shipping back to the US.
Any others?
Can you explain a little in more detail about the 2 invoice strategy?
Sure.
Yeah.
So, perhaps the easiest way to do this is to use the example of the IGU. So I've bought my IG from the US it cost me $10,000 in cost. I've gone ahead and manufactured my window. I've got an invoice that I'm going to provide to my broker that's going to go to the border, and it's going to show that line item of $10,000 for my IGU, and then it's going to be what my customer cost is for the frame or frame materials, whatever you want there. And then I've got an invoice for my customer, which has the IGU and whatever markup to that $10,000 that I need to add. It'll also allow me to add a variety of my labor costs and additional service costs and whatever it is you want to do there. Again, I think you got to be careful about that you could find yourself in a position where, let's say I provided shop drawings as a service. I'm going to try to charge my glass at this really highly inflated cost in order for me to decrease frame costs on the invoice that went to the broker so that I pay less on the overall invoice. But if that's substantially out of the realm of what is comfortable for the border, then they're going to flag me and they're going to have conversations on, are you trying to mismanage this conversation? And I'll be honest, I'm not sure what the consequences of that are, other than I know that there's a risk assessment process for the border that's depending on how regularly you're trading, if you're coming from a country that is viewed as a risk, so on and so forth, the border actually will flag you and then you get reviewed more often. But you don't want that.
Yeah, the suggestion we had on Tuesday was, okay, so it's $100,000 window package. My shop drawings were $90,000 and the windows are 10.
Yeah.
Now, that's probably not going to work.
Yeah, well, and I think this is an important conversation to have, is the border, both at the Canadian side and the US side, is very subjective. That they have the ability, and they've got their set of rules behind the HS code that they have to follow when it comes to substantial transformation, but they're given a lot of leeway on what that means. So we'll use a piece of glass, for instance. I get a piece of float glass that's coming over the border, and then it comes in, and if you feather the edge, is that substantial transformation now? Have you altered that material substantially? It depends on how the border... It depends on the paperwork, really, what the border guard gets. Like, how did you describe the material when it came in, and how did you describe the material when it went out? Yeah, it can be kind of tricky because this is very much a subjective thing when you hit the border.
Okay, let's call it there. We're going to break for lunch. Adrian is around all day. Feel free to grab him when you can. And if it's something that's a really interesting question that we haven't fielded, then we'll get Adrian back up and we can talk about it later. So we're going to break for lunch until 1 o'clock, and we're going to have Rob from Efficiency Manitoba here. Please take some time to visit our exhibitors. Many of them have come a great distance to be here, so they would love to chat with you. Lunch is outside. We're back here at 1 o'clock. Thanks.